In this video, I am reading 5 more categories from the Goodreads Choice Awards. And these are 5 categories that I didn't own a single book for, so I had to do shopping. So this intro is not only an intro, it's a teeny tiny book haul. Some of the categories make sense. Some of the categories make sense. I didn't have anything for non-fiction, memoir, or historical non-fiction because I don't read those genres. I haven't picked up a new release for those genres. They are pretty much brand new genres to me. Audiobook, I didn't have anything for. Kind of makes sense, kind of doesn't. I tend to pick up audiobooks of very specific things I'm interested in, whether or not they're new releases, and then I often return to the same audiobooks over and over again, so it kind of makes sense that I didn't have anything for that one. But the one that baffles me is fiction. I didn't have a single fiction book that was on the list. I'm not a huge reader of fiction, but I do have a relatively big selection from my TBR, so I was surprised that none of the ones that I had picked up made it to the list. But we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna go through and talk about the books I bought for this video, because I did have to buy them all. For fiction, talking of it, I picked up I Hope This Finds You Well. There's very little thought process going into picking out these books, but the little that there is, I will explain to you. I knew that I would be reading this fiction book in amongst a lot of other non-fiction books, and I wanted something that sounded more light-hearted, more fun, so that I could have something to break up the more heavier topics of the non-fiction that I'm going to be reading. So I picked this up. As far as I know, it's like a workplace comedy, which I've never read before, but we're going to give it a go. For non-fiction, again, I didn't want anything too heavy, so I picked up Want by Gillian Anderson. Kind of by Gillian Anderson. It's a collection of anonymous letters about women's fantasies put together into this book with introductions by Gillian Anderson. I heard quite a lot about this book from various people. There was quite a big campaign where I live. For history, I picked up Madness, Race and Insanity in America by Antonia Hilton. Mental health is an important topic to me. It's something that has been present throughout my life in various ways. And so this is the historical non-fiction that appealed to me most out of the list. For memoir, I picked up Sociopath, a memoir by Patrick Gang. Why do I not look up names before I start filming these? Like I said before, mental health is interesting to me, so reading from the perspective who has a mental health condition that I don't know very much about sounded appealing. My hope with nonfiction is basically that I learn something from it and it helps me grow as a person. There's lots of ways to grow. Like, you can grow in understanding, you can grow in empathy, you can grow in compassion, or you can grow in a healing way. It can help heal you. But what I really want to get out of a non-fiction is to understand aspects of the world that I previously didn't have an understanding of. And then for audiobook, I picked up Here One Moment by Liane Moriarty. There isn't much of a reasoning why I picked it up. I wanted something fiction. I didn't want a romance. I wanted it to be a book that I didn't really intend on reading outside of this experiment. Looking at the options for audiobook, I felt like this was something a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And that's the 5 books. That's my mini haul. Those are the 5 brand new books that I'm going to be consuming in this video. I hope we have a grand old time together. I am almost 100 pages into Want. Like I explained before, this is a book of anonymous fantasies by women pertaining to a sexual nature, with introductions by Gillian Anderson, collected by her, arranged by her and her team. There was a fairly chunky introduction by Gillian Anderson, and then it just dived straight into the fantasies. It's divided into sections. I've read the first 2. The first one is kind of about the nature of fantasy itself, what it does for us, what are the good things it does, what are the negative things it does, what impact does it have on our relationships, what impact does it have on the way we move around the world, what do fantasies do for us and why do we do them, as well as delving into women's own personal fantasies within that exploration. Oh, I've read the first 3 sections. One was very little. The next section focused on lack of control within fantasies and what that means to the person who is fantasizing about having their control taken from them, and why women do that. Why is that a repetitive theme among women? Why is that something that is appealing to women? And then the third section was about being idolized and about being worshipped. And I feel like all of these sections have been really good. They've helped explore why women fantasize about the things they do, and they've had a good introduction as to why they're being included in this book and why it's important to explore these types of fantasies. It's really interesting and not too shocking so far. So I'm having a good time in a weird kind of way. I'm 100 pages from the end of Want. My battery cut off in my last clip, so I don't actually remember what I was saying. I think I was telling you about the different sections. I'm not going to continue doing that because if you want to know about them, you have to get the book. That's how it works. I don't often read, and I have never reviewed non-fiction work. It's quite a difficult task for me to try and review this. Do I think it's well structured? Mostly. Each section starts with a little introduction to the section, and those sections are useful to consider when reading the fantasies that follow. It's a bit of a repetitive format. There's always kind of a personal anecdote, often relating to a character that Gillian Anderson has played. There's always a quote from one of the upcoming fantasies trying to solidify her claims about what those fantasies mean. And there's always an explanation of why women fantasize about the things they do and what that means for society in terms of women's roles and their function within society. So that can get a little bit repetitive, even though the subjects of each of those things are different. The fantasies are relatively varied. They've made a big point about not including anything that could be illegal or harmful, which I understand the choice to do that. But I think potentially a better choice would have had a section perhaps with fantasies that were not explicit, but that underlined some of the more extreme fantasies that women have and what that could mean in terms of why women seek out something that is so frowned upon. What I'm trying to say is I think there is a line between including things that are harmful and including things that are important, and I'm not sure if this book so far has towed that line correctly. And I'm purely basing this off of dark romance that I have read and the difficult topics that they often deal with, and how some dark romance can include those in a way that are not harmful and just help show people's more terrifying desires. There haven't been many fantasies about what fear can do for people, and I think that that is something that if I was writing this book I would want to include, because it seems like such a big community of people have that as a narrative within themselves, that fear can be seductive. My reason for reading this book is to develop an understanding of people. I think some of the over-descriptive nature of some of these letters doesn't help me. They're just a little bit long and repetitive. Look at me talking like I'm qualified to review a non-fiction. I've finished Want. I went on a bit of a ramble in the last clip and I'm not sure how much of it I'm going to include. And there were some stories at the end that went against what I was saying when I hadn't finished it. So I think the things that I want to talk about with this book is, the book is an honest review of what people fantasize about, what women specifically fantasize about, and it is a good collection of fantasies. They are fairly broad, they are fairly individual. There's complex fantasies and simple fantasies and detailed fantasies, and all of that is a really good collection for people to read. There are obviously going to be things missing. Your specific fantasy may not be in this book, and so if the aim of the book is to make everyone feel more comfortable with themselves, I'm not sure if it does that. If the aim of the book is to be a look at women and the way they feel in society, I don't feel like this is a complete comprehensive picture. Introductions were fairly repetitive in structure. The acknowledgements do slightly make me question how much of an input Gillian Anderson had into which fantasies were included, and the structure of the book. It was a good, fast read. I think there are people who are out there who will feel ashamed of their fantasies and who will feel alone in their fantasies, and this book could help them feel more like they have a place in society and more like they have an understanding of other people. I did give it 4 stars. I think there are elements of this book that could have been done differently, but that doesn't mean it wasn't done well, and that doesn't mean it's not an engaging and complex read. I've started. I hope this finds you well. I'm reading a mix, loads of different formats for this. Physical book, Kindle and audiobook. Generally they're all great. I'm third-ish of the way in, just around 100 pages. So we're following Jolene. She is living what she herself would describe as quite a sad life. She goes to work, she hates her job, she hates everyone she comes in contact with, and then she goes home and she drinks alone in her sad apartment. I think this book is gonna be a kind of rediscovering joy type book, right? Like, she's gonna re-figure out how to enjoy her life. The premise of that is right at the beginning of the book, she gets pulled into an HR meeting because of an inappropriate, in a non-sexual way, workplace email. She gets reprimanded for it. She also knows there's a rumor about the company laying people off, so this really stresses her out. The company send her to some seminar type things about workplace harassment, and she has to have some software installed on her computer. When she comes back after the weekend, she discovers that the software they installed on her computer actually give her access to everyone's private emails and instant messaging. So she now knows exactly what everyone is sending everyone else in the office. And it's a bit upsetting for her. A lot of people are talking about her behind her back. They feel like she comes across in a way that she doesn't feel like she comes across. There's a lot of upsetting kind of information that she discovers about the way the other people think of her. So she decides to use this information to try and keep her job in this new potential restructuring. It's supposed to be funny, and it is funny. I wouldn't say it's laugh out loud hilarious, but I am enjoying picking it up and reading it. Jolene is a very antisocial character. She struggles a lot with social interactions and the way she should behave and the way she's coming across. And I feel like that can be quite a relatable way to feel in certain scenarios. Yeah, I'm having a good time. I don't think this is groundbreaking so far, but it is enjoyable. It's quite a fast read. There's lots of comedic moments in it. And Jolene is a pretty relatable character. So overall, good stuff. I'm gonna make this quick because I just want to get back to it. This is kind of what I thought it was going to be, in that it is recognizing that people aren't as two-dimensional as you think they are from the outside, but it's also not what I thought it was going to be, in that it is much more kind of heart-wrenching than I was expecting. It is not just a comedy. It is funny. I can recognize that even with my absolutely terrible ability of recognizing comedy in books. This is funny and the situations are funny, but it is also incredibly sweet and at parts really like gut-wrenching. Jolene sometimes makes terrible decisions and it's difficult to agree with everything she does, but it all comes from this like intense fear, which is quite a recognizable emotion. I'm 2/3 of the way in, I would say, and I'm really enjoying it. This was so much more successful than I thought it was going to be. I ended up having a great time with this book. There's a lot of real kind of humanity in this book. It's very heartwarming, very caring, and Jolene is sometimes a difficult character to root for, but you do root for her anyway. I think a lot of people will identify with her difficulties in life and will identify with her lack of enthusiasm about her job. I think it could be hard for people to agree with her actions throughout most of the book. You do want a good outcome for her at the end, and I will not tell you how it ends, but I will say it is relatively positive. I gave it 4.2 stars. I did cry in this book. I did get to the point where I wept. I'm happy that Goodreads made me pick this up. For me, this book is the most outside of my comfort zone, and it's not because of the subject matter, it's because of the way it is written. This is the most like a textbook book I think I've ever read. This is a book about Crownsville Hospital, which was built in 1911 and was the state's answer for rising levels of mental health problems within the Black community. This book is doing a great job at not only exposing horrific treatment that was happening inside the hospital, but also at examining why people are there to begin with, the trauma that Black people went through and how that would contribute to the mental health struggles of the communities. This is another book that I don't necessarily know how to talk about in a review type of way. A lot of the times my reviews are based on my enjoyment of a book, or how much a book made me feel, or how much a book emotionally impacted me. While there are things in here that evoke emotion, they are not being presented in an emotional way. They are being presented as the facts they are. I think this book is going to be an incredibly important read, but it's a little bit of a struggle for me to read it. It's a lot of facts, it's a lot of figures, it's a lot of names and dates. There are personal stories interwoven throughout the book, which I really appreciate, because for me, having that personal factor really helps me get through a book like this. But it is a book for learning. It's a book for understanding and educating yourself, rather than a book necessarily for enjoyment's sake. So I think this is going to be a tough read, both for the textbook-like nature of it, but also for all the horrific things that are depicted within the pages. And I think it's going to be tough for me to talk about. Why I put myself in this situation, who knows? I thought it was a good idea at the time. I got to part 2. It is broken up into parts. At least the first few parts are based on years that the hospital was open, but it does go beyond those years, both in the past and in the future. It's really good so far. I am not disliking any of the writing style. Am I upset by the actions of the people within it? Yes. Is it horrific to hear about the way people were treated? Absolutely. But the delivery of that information has been great. I have gotten to part 4. I think there's about 100 pages left, because quite a lot at the back is references. It still reads mostly like a textbook, but there are a lot of personal experiences within the pages. There's a lot of reports from people who worked at the facility, who knew people who went to the facility, who had relatives who died at the facility. There's a lot of personal stories in this book, but it is surrounded by a lot of factual information. It does go beyond just what happened at this facility, and it is an exploration of what happened to Black people during the time periods depicted within the book, and how those situations related to people in the asylum, how it related to people coming in, how it related to how people were treated there, how it related to the system that got those people there in the first place, and what that meant for people outside. It's how the people in the system were viewed by society. It's how mental illness within the Black community was viewed, and how it compared to how white experiences of mental illness were viewed. A kind of sprawling depiction of what it was like to exist in this time as a Black person, and how that is related to what was happening in the asylum. It's very thoughtful, it's very intelligent, it's clearly well researched. The thing I wish we had more of is patients telling their own stories, but I understand that that is a fantastical wish. The people in the asylum never got the ability to tell their own stories. They never had the ability to be heard outside of the asylum. So we have to learn about these patients from the people who knew them, both from working in the facility and outside the facility. And I think she's doing a good job at trying to tell patient stories through other people's eyes, and she is doing a good job at that. It's great that she is bringing to light stories that would never have been told if it weren't for this book. Finish Madness, I've given it 4 stars. It is a really great resource for understanding people's experiences over quite a long time, coming up to 100 years. It's got good social commentary and good personal stories and interesting examinations of mental health and society throughout that time. I said before I wish there was more first-hand patient information, and there were a few, but there wasn't a huge amount of first-hand knowledge from patients. At the end, there is a collection of artwork and writing from some of the patients, and throughout there are poetry and songs from patients, but I also understand that that might have been too difficult a thing to achieve with the amount of resources that are still available. The only other thing that I would critique about this is that I felt a little confused by the time jumping. While the sections were specific time periods, the narrative would often jump between different dates extending beyond those time periods. So I did get a little bit confused with the constant time jumping. So I think perhaps including a timeline would have been helpful that you could refer back to with some of the more important dates. I think it also would have clarified when people's experiences overlapped or certain things were happening at the same time as other things, because I found it difficult to hold all the dates in my head at the same time. But other than that, I think it was really good. I think it's a really good book. I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from what happened in these pages and what happened in history. So if that appeals to you, then give it a go. I'm about 5 hours into the audiobook, and it is not what I expected. I'm trying to consume this book purely in its audiobook form because that was how it was categorized, right? Like, it was categorized as an audiobook. This is the audiobook category. So I am trying to consume it purely in audiobook form. The narrator is great. The synopsis is basically, there are all these people on a flight. One woman on that flight stands up and starts going to every individual person and predicting their cause of death and their age of death. I know, because of the synopsis of the book, because of some of the things said within the book, that these predictions come true to an extent. I don't know how many of them, all of them, one of them, it could be loads, it could be one. There is some truth to what she says. However, I'm approaching a third of the way into the book and no deaths have occurred and surprising things have happened. The first surprising things is that we get points of view from the woman. I thought she was going to be some kind of mysterious figure who turns up with the plane and then disappears into the night, but that isn't true. She is a fully formed character on her own. She has a past, she has a present, she has a future, and all of it is being discussed in her sections. The other thing is, it's a multiple POV book, which I think is really interesting. You get perspectives from multiple people on the plane, from the flight attendant to a mother to a father of children to a guy who's just lost his best friend. And all of these people have their own relationships with death and with this premonition that they've been given. We've learned a lot about these characters. We've learned their backstory. We've learned a lot of their hopes and dreams. We've learned a lot about what's going on in their lives, and we've learned why they were on the plane, which is a big exploration of this first part of the book. And we also learned little things about other characters who are on the plane. Not everyone gets their own point of view, but there are a lot of point of views to be going around. The audiobook narrator has an Australian accent because this is set in Sydney or on a plane to Sydney. I'm all for that. It's nice to have a non-American accent for an audiobook because so many books have American audiobook narrators. The writing and the narrator is doing a good job at giving each of the people their own personality, their own individual style, which I think is both great writing and great narrating. And I'm really intrigued to see where the book goes from here, because it's felt quite slow, right? Like, this is, so far we've pretty much only had the plane ride. It's been a lot of backstory, it's been a lot of setting the scene, and that's all really great, but I wonder if things are going to start to pick up or whether it's going to maintain this kind of slow pulsing pace. Colour me intrigued. I'm like a couple of hours away from the end of the audiobook, and this book is just not what I was expecting at all, and I can't quite decide if I'm on board with that or not. Most of the book is just learning about these different people that we've met on the plane, their different but relatively subtle reactions to hearing when they're gonna die or people they love are gonna die. There's a lot of exploration of family dynamics and people's worries and how the people around them react and how people become more and more convinced that these predictions could be true and what that means for them. And the character we actually get the most information about, which I didn't realize we would, is the woman who does the predictions. Her chapters are every other chapter, so we get a lot from her point of view, and they're specifically her retelling her story. And I wonder if that's going to be a part of the plot, like maybe she's retelling her story to someone or to a news article, or why she's retelling her story, but it is her retelling essentially her life story. So we get a lot of information about her. It is just these kind of character explorations, right? Like it's these questions of why people react the way they do, why their family reacts the way they do, who they tell, who they don't tell, who they involve. So I would describe it as like subtly interesting. I think I was expecting more extreme reactions from characters, people making big decisions based on what they've heard, and so far that hasn't really happened. There is scope for it to still happen, but at the moment it hasn't. I think I was expecting a slightly faster pace. But this slow kind of look into human nature is also interesting, but not like a super fun time. I'm gonna finish it up. What can I say about this book? This book is character studies, right? It's just character studies of the people who were on the plane and the woman who gave the predictions. And in that, I think it was relatively well done. There's a lot of different people with a lot of different personalities. They're all distinct and they are all fairly well-rounded and have complexities to them. I think there was too much of Cherry, the woman who gave the predictions. I don't think we needed the amount of detail about her life that we got. I almost think there were too many perspectives to engage completely with each of the characters. There were perspectives I wanted more from. There were perspectives I wanted less of. And sometimes it took so long to return to a perspective that I kind of forgotten about them by the time we got back to them. It's in the audiobook category, and I think as an audiobook it was good. The narrator managed to keep the perspectives clear through her voice work. At some points I forgot that it was only one narrator because she did such a good job at portraying different people. There was nothing super interesting with the production of the audiobook. It was just the story being told as the story. There wasn't any music or editing that made it specifically interesting, but it is a really good, solid audiobook. I'm glad I got to listen to it. I gave it 3.5. It wasn't for me, I don't think. I would describe the book as reflective, which isn't always my favourite type of book, but it has good, strong character exploration and a good narrative. But the thing I was most disappointed by was the ending, which felt remarkably underwhelming to me, and I think could have had a more emotional punch to it than it did. But generally it was pretty fine and I enjoyed my time with it. I have made it to part 2. It's maybe a quarter to a third of the way through the book. I didn't look up how to pronounce her name. I really should do that. This is a memoir about, in my brain, I read Patrice. I at first read Patrick, but now I read Patrice. I don't know what is the correct way of saying it. I'm gonna call her Patrice. It's really interesting. So far, it's just focused on her childhood pretty much. The last chapter focused on a relationship that she had when she was 14 and what that did for her. It's a lot about her relationship with her mother and her relationship with herself. I think it's really useful for understanding people with sociopathic tendencies. There is some level at which I can understand her struggles, and there is another level at which the things she is going through are completely alien to me, and she does things I wouldn't consider doing in a million years. In the introduction, made it clear that she wanted to write this book so that other people who felt like her wouldn't feel so alone. And I think that is a great reason to write a book. I agree with the quote on the cover that it is incredibly thoughtfully done and it is incredibly personal to the author. And both those things make it quite a tender read. She may be quite an abrasive child because she can't understand things like empathy, but reading for her perspective, you do feel for her. You understand what she's going through and you understand the difficulty she's having. So I think in that respect, so far the book is really successful at what it's aiming to do. It's pretty captivating. I read all of that in that whole part 1 in one sitting and wasn't bored, wasn't distracted. I had a good time reading it and understanding what life was like for her. I am that far in. I got to part 3. Her name is pronounced Patrick. I picked up the audiobook briefly. It's narrated by the author and she says her name Patrick. So now we all know. This is a person's journey into discovering themselves and in turn discovering what it means to be a sociopath. I don't know how to review a memoir. It's someone's life. It's written well. It's engaging and interesting and funny at times. It's kind of interesting to see a book written by someone who claims they don't feel things, but obviously has a very varied emotional reaction to things. They might not be the emotions we understand, but there is emotion in the writing. I'm really enjoying it. It's clever and thoughtful and well-paced. Has a lot to say about being a sociopath and what the journey of discovering that diagnosis was like for her. She's older now and more aware of her role to herself and within society, and it's a really interesting perspective to read from, and I am having a good time. I have finished Sociopath. This, I think, is an interesting read. It has a lot of entertaining and interesting insight as to what it's like to be Patrick and what her experience is like moving through the world. I have seen some reviews questioning the authenticity of the book, questioning the true kind of psychoanalytic instances that happen within the book. Part of that comes from the fact that sociopath is an outdated term and is no longer used in diagnosis. Maybe consider that when you consider picking up this book. I also saw people complain that there wasn't enough data in this book, and that didn't bother me. This is a memoir. This is someone's personal experience, and it isn't a textbook. It's not a diagnostic tool. This is not for someone to learn from. This is for people to feel less alone. And I don't think that they need data in order to achieve that. This was entertaining and engaging and well written, but I think you have to take it with a grain of salt that when someone is telling a memoir in this way, with scenes recreated, when specific dialogue is used, that no one has a memory good enough to achieve that. So there may be elements of fiction in this, or there may be elements of misremembering, or there may be elements of compiling conversations into one, or all sorts of different things that mean this is not a 100% accurate historic retelling of her life. If you want that historic retelling, this isn't an amazing book. If you want something readable and entertaining and to give you a different perspective on how people think, I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. Before you pick this up, consider what this book is, and if it's not what you're looking for, don't pick it up. Right, it is the end. Let's get it all wrapped up. I read 5 books for this video, completing another 5 categories of the Goodreads Choice Awards. We are now down to the shortlist, and I think the day I post this is going to be the last day of voting. So some of these books are no longer eligible to be voted for, and I think that's interesting. Let's start with Here One Moment by Leanne Moriarty. It was in the audiobook category, and it is no longer there. It did not make the final round. It did make the final round in the fiction category, and I think that is appropriate for the book. The book was good, not for me, but it was good, and the audiobook was good, but I wouldn't say it was something outstanding or specifically very, very special. So I understand why it was kept in the fiction category, but was not brought forward for the audiobook category. I gave it 3.5 stars. I enjoyed my time with it, but I think the messaging was a little unclear. It was a little bit long. For the fiction category, I read I Hope This Finds You Well by Natalie Sue. I really enjoyed this book. I had a great time with it. I gave it 4.25, I think, in the end. This is still eligible to be voted for. It's funny and heartwarming and gut-wrenching, and at some points a bit of a difficult read. It has its darker moments, but I really appreciated it for what it was. I really liked that it didn't just stay light-hearted all the time, and that it had some real human moments in it. For non-fiction, I read Want. This is still in the shortlist. I gave it 4 stars. I had a good time with this book. If you're looking for something a little bit fun, a little bit silly, a little bit socially aware, a little bit scandalous or shocking, I think this is a good book to read. But I do think there's nothing in here that you couldn't find in the romance section if you looked hard enough. I read Sociopath for the memoir section. This is still eligible to be voted for. The point of this book is to make people feel less alone. It's to share her experience and to make people who feel like her feel like there is options for them and that they are not alone. I am not one of those people, so this book is not really written for me. But as someone who doesn't feel the same way as Patrick. I had a really good time getting to know her, getting to understand her, and getting to experience life through her eyes. It's readable, it's entertaining, it's dark sometimes, but I had a good time. I gave it 4 stars, and if you're looking for something readable, I would pick it up. The final book I read, Madness, Race and Insanity in America by Antonia Hilton. This book is sadly no longer eligible to be voted for. This was an incredibly interesting book. The facts that are shown in this book are often pretty devastating and pretty heartbreaking. And I think she did an incredible job at interweaving what was happening in the asylum with what was happening in the wider world and what those things meant for people living in that time. I have a couple of issues with it, but none that are groundbreaking or mean that this book is not a triumph for what it's trying to be. I gave it 4 stars. Even though it's not on the list, I would still recommend it if you want to understand a little bit more, not only about the healthcare system, but what it was like to be a black person in America during this time period. I'm sad that I can no longer vote for this. That's it. That's all the books I read for this video. I'm gonna go vote now for the things that I have read and the things that I enjoyed. While Goodreads is a ridiculous award, I think it does just add a little bit of fun to life. These books were all new to me, and they're pretty much all genres I wouldn't normally pick up. So I'm really glad that I had this opportunity to pick them up and to give some stuff I wouldn't normally read a go. But in the final video of the series, we're going to be returning to the categories that I know more about, and I am going to read the winners from those categories. If you want to stick around for that video, I would love to have you, but I'll see you in the next video, which might come out sooner than you think.